So welcome everybody. We're very pleased indeed that at the first seminar for the Southeast Asia Research Center program for this semester, we have such a good turnout and such a lovely setting here, and we're very pleased to have an outstanding speaker as well, Professor Kenneth Paul Tan, who is speaking today about Singapore's finest years coming to an end, the prospects and limits of authoritarian pragmatism. Kenneth is an associate professor at NUS, the National University of Singapore, and as Kenneth and I were discussing, there are strong links between NUS and CityU and AIS, Asian International Studies in particular. We have a number of colleagues who've done their work there previously or been educated there. So we're very pleased to meet another a member of the distinguished NUS team working on Southeast Asia. Kenneth is in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where he's taught since 2007 and served as the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs. He's also taught at the NUS Scholars Program in Political Science Department. He's received numerous teaching awards and was elected as chair of the NUS Teaching Academy. His research is focused on theorizations and formulations of liberalization by passing through the contemporary lens of Singapore experience, which I think many of us here agree is a fascinating case, aside from the fact that, of course, it's an interesting parallel to Hong Kong, former British colony, and so on, but somehow seems to be very, very different, particularly at this point in time. We don't see a huge number of protests in Singapore anymore. I'm missing something. Anyway, Kenneth has had various visiting fellowships at the Australian National University here in Hong Kong, Chinese U, Georgetown, Harvard, Sciences Po, University of Duisburg-Essen. I won't go on to about his further publications, which are plentiful. I'll just end here by thanking him for coming and also doing a little bit of advertising for our next talk, which is on October 21st. We also have a distinguished speaker then, Professor Edmund Gomez, well-known expert on Malaysian political economy, and his talk is in fact New Malaysia Political Economy, Politics, Business, and Power Consolidation, with particular reference, of course, to the change of government after the last general election in Malaysia and the rise, or better said, the return of Mahathir Mohamad. That's another interesting story. However, as I promised, we now turn over to Kenneth. We usually have about 45-50 minutes of talk of the seminar, and then we'll open it up later for discussion, so please keep your questions in mind. So let's welcome Kenneth Tan. Thank you again for coming.
Perhaps I might just come to the front. Would that be okay? Yeah, sure. It's such a beautiful meet. Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to lead us in thinking about this question about whether Singapore's finest years are coming to an end. For many of you, that might seem like a rather ridiculous question to ask. And that might be because you look at Singapore and what you see is a country, a city that still is prosperous, materially wealthy, a country that still has a government that you might describe as stable, durable, a government that is clean in many respects and is able to attract some of the smartest people to join its ranks. You might see in Singapore a society that has been stable for a very long time in spite of its diversity, not just in terms of class, in terms of language, religion, race, but diverse also in terms of the sort of ideological positions that people have taken. You might see in Singapore also a city that is livable in the sense of being suitably greened, a city that has infrastructure that for the most part works, a city that is safe, and a city that's devoted quite a lot of resources towards building up its technology in the interest of zero energy projects, but also in the interest of more precise modes of urban governance. You might see also a country that is strongly defended in military terms, a country that has leveraged on its reputation to produce a brand that is attractive. People look at Singapore for ideas, if not very just the inspiration to develop and to grow. And all those things come together to give Singapore a disproportionately large amount of influence in the global sphere. So if you looked at Singapore and you saw all these things, you would naturally say, how could Singapore's finest years possibly be coming to an end? But others among us might look more closely, and we would see other things. We would see a government that has become more narrowly elitist in fact. You might see a government that's in many ways trapped by methods of achieving success that have become formulas, and formulas that have become shackles, right? You might see a government that was able to implement many of its policies simply because it didn't have to worry so much about democratic elections, but now have to because electoral pressure has meant that long-term planning must now take into account the shorter-term electoral cycles and all the complications that come with that. You might also see a public that is not particularly strong in terms of civic cultures, democratic skills and capabilities. You might see a city that at one time could fairly be described as efficient, safe, every trains all run on time, but a city that today seems to be coming under some strain, not least because of the density, right? The people who are living in the numbers of residents has increased tremendously, and that has a lot to do with immigration, a very liberal approach to immigration. You might also see, if you looked closely, very high levels of depression because it is a competitive society and a rather unforgiving society. You will see inequality rising very, very quickly, and the emergence of poverty that we never used to see in a place like Singapore, all of which, of course, adds even more pressure to mental health. And you will see a lot of talk in the public discourse about Industry 4.0, New Industrial Revolution, and all the changes that I anticipated as a result of automation and artificial intelligence, and what that's going to mean for unemployment, prospect of unemployment, and just people being even more demoralized. You will see an obsession with shifts in geopolitics. What does it mean when China and the US rivalry shifts in the way that it has in more recent years? What space is there for Singapore to play with? And if you look at all these particular factors, you might come to the conclusion that Singapore's finest years are in fact coming to an end. I like to think that there are elements of both positions that are true. And one of the reasons I think that is because Singapore's post-colonial experience has been short, which means to say that a lot has happened since 1965. And the nation-building imperatives of the 60s and 70s, the high developmentalism of the 70s and 80s, they haven't disappeared just because Singapore entered in the 90s into the global city realm. In fact, a lot of the past has intruded into the present in such a way as to create fundamental contradictions and tensions. The main contradiction, in my mind, is that between the global city and the nation state, both of which are incomplete projects, parallel, but also contradictory. And a lot of my work has actually drawn on this particular contradiction. I've thought about how Singapore's developmental state, for instance, has had to deal with various tensions and contradictions as it embraces all the imperatives of being a global city. What I want to do today is to focus in particular on the question of pragmatism, which is often celebrated as a key pillar in Singapore's success story. But I want to suggest that while pragmatism has, in its purer sense, been useful for Singapore's developmental experience, it eventually comes to converge with what today we understand by neoliberal globalization. In fact, it comes to stand in for neoliberalism. I will want to argue that in many ways it disguises neoliberalism. And there are things I've written in the past that speak to this idea. I've written about cinema and television in Singapore that draws on this idea of neoliberalism. I'm currently working on meritocracy in what I want to describe as the age of neoliberal globalization. And I'm also writing about smart cities in East Asia. When I think of neoliberal globalization, I also consider the ways in which it provokes counter-tendencies, largely in the form of, I guess, the most degraded versions of populism, authoritarian populism. That's a major tension that I explore in my work, and increasingly a tension that I try to identify in the public sphere. I've begun to think more carefully about these tensions within public morality, and in particular focusing on moral panics that explode within these spaces as a way of understanding that tension between neoliberalism and populism. So the last piece of, the last book that I'm working on currently is a book that I'm calling Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, Pragmatism and Moral Panic in Singapore. So that's kind of the setting where I'm coming from. So pragmatism, right, suggests perhaps that Singapore is open to all kinds of possibilities and able to adapt to circumstances. But we know, of course, that there are structures in place in the way we understand ourselves as a nation. There is very clearly a national narrative, a story that is told collectively, usually from a top-down, in a top-down way, which tries to galvanize people, that recruits people into a sense of being part of a larger project with a past and with a future. It has a structure, and it plays out hugely in various spheres of cultural life in Singapore. I thought I would just focus on one of these more spectacular example of cultural life in Singapore, and it's our National Day parade. Once every year, massive dose of patriotism, but very clearly expressive of some of these ideas in the national narrative. So, most important in this narrative is the idea of leadership. Right? So, the president is featured very strongly. The president as a symbolic leader, a president as largely addressing the social and emotional needs of the country. Ceremonial, for the most part. But part of this story also highlights the role of the People's Action Party government as an elite, clean, heroic, post-colonial government that has, in a sloganistic way, taken Singapore from third world to first world. And that theme rings through the narrative in a very, very loud and resonant way. So leadership is a key point in the national narrative. So this idea of third world to first world, that notion of success, is always undergirded by profound vulnerability and fear. So showcased in these parades is also a very strong statement of threat, scarcity, that these threats need continuously to be overcome, and whatever success Singapore has gained cannot be taken for granted, because without vigilance and with complacency, everything can unravel. So that's also emblematized. And then society. A key message in society, a key social message in the national narrative is that Singapore society is diverse, but diverse in a very particular way. It's made up of 4 racial categories, right? And the word race is literally used in Singapore. Chinese, the majority; Malays, the significant minority; Indians, the minority; and an others category, which usually is signified by Eurasians. And this is a very rigid notion of diversity in Singapore. And it's played out in a certain kind of hyphenated way. So in the parade, Malays perform, and then Chinese perform, and then the Indians perform, and then the Eurasians perform, and then finally everyone comes together in a mixed dance with a kind of interwoven sense of national unity. And that's the structure of how we are expected to think about national identity. Always this tension between race and nation. And of course we have expressions, verbal expressions of this problematic. We talk about unity in the national pledge, always and everywhere, signaling transcendence over race, language, and religion. We talk about aspirations, always with a view to what needs to be overcome. And of course, there's a national anthem that is sung, and popular patriotic songs that also kind of bring a sort of embodied pleasure to being a Singaporean. And with all, as with all national parades, the orgasmic moment is important. An explosion of heightened kind of national patriotic feelings. But the story shifts a little bit. These days, a lot more emphasis is placed on the younger generation. Almost a call to them to be responsible for dreaming about Singapore's future because they have enjoyed the dreams of the past. So they're moving in these softer directions. We now embrace diversity and inclusion. We talk about Singaporeans who are disadvantaged and need help, but again, always with a certain kind of skepticism about how much help, right? A basic, you might say pragmatic assumption that we often make is too much help will spoil people and they will take advantage of help. So always help within limits, but make sure people are self-reliant. So that's a very strong message that comes across. And the emotional is creeping in more pronounced ways. So we now talk about stories, we now talk about emotions, we now talk about being anchored to a place called home. So these are the messages that come across in the parades. We also produce a lot of these branding videos, right? National branding, city branding videos that tell a very similar story. You see straight away an account of vulnerability and then success, overcoming in these various fields, and then you see expressions of diversity, inclusiveness, and the fun that Singapore aspires to provide, right, in its more global city manifestations. So Singapore does parades for its people, it produces branding videos for investments, but then increasingly people from outside looking in an admiring way at Singapore have also begun to produce videos about Singapore, also in tones that are very admiring. So Nas Daily produced this one that describes Singapore as a nearly perfect country. So these messages continue to orientate and shape the ways that Singapore discourse makes sense of circumstances, how we frame our problems, and the sorts of solutions that are available to us. For instance, when we think about the state, we often think about the state as being successful or responsible for Singapore's success because it is clean, because it is meritocratic in terms of its access to talent, ability to attract talent, and because it is pragmatic. So let's focus on pragmatism. So I looked at a lot of speeches and policy papers over the decades to get a better sense of what pragmatism has meant in Singapore. And pragmatism has meant quite a number of different things. They belong, I suppose, to a kind of a family of ideas. And I describe them in these ways. I'll take you through each of them to get a better sense of how they can be differentiated from one another. And what I want to do is to also show how the meanings in the practice start to degenerate, right? So we move from the no, Singapore's finest years are not coming to an end, to a yes, Singapore's finest years perhaps are coming to an end. So let's begin with this particular definition of pragmatism, that it is non-dogmatic, that it is instrumental. I guess one way to think about this is to think of the nation as going on a journey with a destination, a route, a way of getting there, and certain assumptions about the mode of travel. If you extend this to the nation itself, you'd see that destination could be national goals, route could be what sort of techniques and methods you have at your disposal to get there, and the conditions of travel, perhaps speaking to the assumptions that are made about journeys like these. So, what does it mean to be pragmatic in this sense? You might say that one can still be pragmatic whilst abiding by certain assumptions, right? So pragmatic doesn't have to mean that we're open to any assumptions, any methods, any goals. We could still be pragmatic if we assume that we do live in conditions of vulnerability, that we do value individualism or believe that individualism shapes the possibilities of cooperation and community, and the assumption that the state needs to be strong and elite for Singapore to be able to make this journey. So one could still say that holding these assumptions allows us still to be pragmatic and not dogmatic. You might also be able to say that we could still be pragmatic if we maintain these assumptions, but we have a clearer sense of what the goals might be. So in Singapore's case, quite aside from those assumptions, we also have more and more come to believe that the goals ought to be economic growth, the goals of economic growth. They are goals that shouldn't be compromised. Anything else is possible as long as growth is not compromised. Now, you might still argue that we could be pragmatic because we've got a set of fixed goals, we've got assumptions about the world, but we use our critical problem-solving abilities to figure out how to get there, free of ideology. However, what seems to be happening in Singapore these days is that as we make this journey and as we keep arriving at the same destination, the comfort of that journey has taught us that there is one way to get there, or there are fewer ways than we'd like to think. And so the methods and techniques have now started to congeal around certain success formulas, certain laws that we put in place, certain policies that we insist upon, and certain programs that we're wedded to. So what begins as a pragmatic approach to achieving economic growth with certain assumptions about who we are starts to solidify, to concretize into ways of doing that are anything but pragmatic. Okay, so that's one sense I thought we should pay attention to. Here's a second sense. Pragmatism in Singapore often means an impatience for things that are theoretical, philosophical, the subtleties in arguments. Singapore government and policymakers, when you talk to them, they have very little patience for these fine distinctions. As a result of that, we find that they're very often dismissive of academics, they're very often dismissive of philosophers and certainly artists. So those kinds of arguments don't make it into the space of policy making, right? They're kept out. There's no appetite for these fine distinctions, any sort of sophisticated argument. What you want are results. And the artists, the academics, philosophers are condemned to a kind of notional ivory tower, which is ironic, because in effect, it's the policymakers who end up making beautifully technical policies within their ivory tower. But all in all, what ends up happening is the public culture in Singapore is generally quite intolerant of critical thinking, critical theory. Okay, so that's another point about pragmatism. Now, the third meaning of pragmatism has to do with best practices. Now, again, this is best attention to best practices and not reinventing the wheel and learning from others has its value, right? For new societies that don't have a lot of time and have limited resources, it's better not to experiment too much and waste resources. It's a lot better to learn from others, because whatever problems we face have probably been experienced by other countries, and the trick is to learn from them and to sensitively adapt them to our circumstances. I think we did that quite well for the most part. But underlying that attitude of searching for best practices is actually an impatience for results. So pragmatism, in a sense, is driven, this form of pragmatism is driven by wanting instant results. And there's a short-term aspect to this impatience that often means that policymakers these days, or leaders of public organizations, would not think twice about focusing on the annual cycle of delivering key performance indicators, for instance. You want to get quick results. And you would ride your people, you would use up resources, you would exploit your resources and people at the expense of their dignity, perhaps, at the expense of their well-being, just to produce the sort of results that can be shown as signals of success. As a result of this also, there's a much less appetite to invest in things that will only yield results later on, because someone else gets the credit for that. So there's a certain sort of psychology that emerges from this impatience. You look at Singapore also, and you will find that very often this impatience for results has meant that rather than cultivating our own people, nurturing our own people so that they would grow and be able to contribute to Singapore's development and success, instead of doing that, we are much more likely to import ready-made solutions and ready-made figures and numbers. So the rise of the foreign talent discourse, right? That Singapore would bend backwards for big names bearing big numbers to come to Singapore and just raise the average rather than cultivate the people who are already there. So the metaphor of a hotel Singapore starts to ring true. Singapore becomes more and more like a hotel rather than a nation, a place where people can come in, do their business, and check out. Now you put all these things together, and what you end up happening, is a highly demoralized workforce, people, and attention paid to buying results, and the hollowing out of this space, whether in terms of talent or in terms of just a sense of belonging, a sense of responsibility for the place. Okay, so that's best practices. A fourth meaning in pragmatism, I would argue, is a realist meaning. And by this I mean, it's a position that asserts that certain things are not worth trying to change. Take them as givens, right? Make them your operating assumptions and work around them. Don't bang your head against the wall, because it's not going to make a change there. So the pragmatism in this form might, in Singapore's case, assume that human nature is of a of a particular kind, right? That people are selfish, they're greedy, they cannot be generous. And if you put all these things together, then you have the ideal explanations against welfare, state welfare. You also have the conditions in which anyone who turns out to be generous and altruistic and who wants to do good for society is immediately held in high suspicion. And that has an implication on civil society, right? That space of volunteerism and doing good. Another assumption that we make in this realist vein is that race is a certain kind of way. People are much more, in Singapore, are much more connected to their racial identities, which have centuries of history, than they are to their national identity, which is plastic and new. So if that is the case, we couldn't simply go for a nation built around notions of Singaporeanness. It will always have to take into account that which cannot be eliminated. Chineseness, Indianness, Malayness, and so on. And that's why we get into all these contradictions when it comes to how we build the nation or the national identity. So we hold on to this biological rather than cultural notion of race, and as a result of it, we're rather regressive when it comes to the more constructivist approaches to identity building. In fact, worse than that, it does often encourage a certain kind of racialism, or you might even say racism, embedded within the system itself. A third assumption that we often make, the realist position that some things are unchangeable, so work around them rather than try to transform them, has to do with Singapore as a small state. So if we're small, we have to behave small, right? We have to make friends with everyone, we have to leverage on our soft power, we can't change the operating system, we can't change the global environment, so work around the parameters. Okay, so that's the realist sense of pragmatism. Now the fifth sense has to do with intangibles. That, and maybe this has something to do with impatience also. We want to have things that we can count, that we can feel and touch and benefit from in a concrete way. Which means that there's very little appetite for value that is not economic, for example. Rarely do we talk about social capital or the ease with which social capital is depleted in the sort of harsh national development projects that we pursue. Rarely do we think about heritage value other than when it can be quantified for tourism. Rarely do we think about cultural, aesthetic, and certainly not spiritual value. So there's a kind of vulgarization of life. That everything gets reduced to the material, everything gets reduced to the economic, everything gets reduced to things that you can count. In this space, a lot that is what we would think of as externalities disappear, or they get included only when calculable. You might say this is the dominance of money, the dominance, the primacy of the logic of the market. Another sense, another meaning of pragmatism in Singapore has to do with, I suppose, new public management and some more managerial approaches to life and to policy. We've been more private sector-like since the late 80s, certainly since the 90s in Singapore. Our public service, in fact, perhaps every organization thinks in terms of being audited, thinks in terms not so much of the broader impact that one makes, but in terms of the small KPIs that one has to deliver. Take this into the philosophy, familiar philosophy of people like Hannah Arendt, and you know that this kind of leads to evil in its most banal sense. The public service as a place that almost dehumanizes through its infatuation with the technicality of policy making. The problem of dehumanization. So I want to also say that in its I suppose most ideological form, pragmatism has now come to stand for economic growth. We know that the assumptions draw from a particular understanding of our survivalist developmental years, and we know that the neoliberal solution and economic growth as the overriding, uncompromisable goals come out from our experience since the 90s of being a global city. The economics is our savior. So in this most ideological sense, pragmatism becomes this fig leaf for naked capitalism, for elitism, for power, for the status quo. And it is animated by the anxieties, the risk aversions, and the conservatism that draws from an earlier period of survivalism. I'll just take a little bit more time to apply some of these distinctions in 3 areas, which I think might be interesting for you. One is multiracialism, the sense of how we understand diversity, which is very particular. Secondly, meritocracy. And finally, the notion of leadership. So multiracialism. We inhabit this space, right, between pluralism and integration. We do have an idea of Singaporeanness, which transcends the individual racial groups, but we're also, so we have this sense of an equal identity that comes, that is equidistant from these individual ethnic identities, but we also maintain allegiance to these ethnic identities at the same time. So we're both, in a sense, pluralist and integrationist, and that's kind of the difficulty in multiracialism. There's a history to this. When Singapore first became independent, some of the founding fathers, Mr. Rajaratnam, for instance, argued that we should try to move away from Chineseness, move away from Indianness, Malayness, and try to embrace being Singapore much more proactively, much more deliberately. And that went for quite a while, right, as the prevailing approach to national development. But before too long, Lee Kuan Yew and his people went into realist pragmatist mode, and they said, no, that's not possible, right? We cannot do away with our ethnic identities. So they went back to the pluralist model of having attachments to each of these ethnic groups. And today we have a kind of a hybrid that connects these two approaches. But what does it, so we often given certain metaphors for thinking of this. One, the second Prime Minister in Singapore, for instance, said maybe we should think of this as overlapping circles, right? We should encourage the Chinese to practice their cultural, their cultures, their language, their habits, and so on and so forth, and the Malays to do their own, and the Indians to do their own, but have a notion of Singaporeanness where these circles overlap. And he said that over time, as people interacted more, the overlapping space will expand. So this is kind of the opposite of the social engineering model, right? That organically over time, what is Singaporean will authentically expand. In reality, though, we've been rather vulgar about our cultural understanding. So we still think of ourselves as in 4-part harmony, right? That we have these 4 racial groups so standing side by side in a certain kind of, there's a certain ocularity to it, right? They look a certain way. And this is how we understand our cultural diversity, which is extremely limiting. Most recent, of course, is this, the National Day Parade, staring you in the face, right? Blatantly. And I did some work about 10 years ago in this book, which, well, part of this book looked at racial stereotypes, and they're plentiful in the sitcoms and dramas on TV and the popular films. Just numerous stereotypes that circulate endlessly, right, creating pleasures in everyday life. Now, you know, so what are stereotypes? Stereotypes reflect power structures within society, right? But not only do they reflect them, they go right back to reinforcing them as well. So there's a certain kind of insidiousness, and it's insidious because these spaces seem like very innocent popular cultural spaces. Now you might think, okay, no big deal, right? That's a first world problem or something like that. But it is much more of a problem when we start to apply our understanding of racial difference to questions of leadership. So and here's where we become really contradictory in talking about the president, as a largely ceremonial position. We employ positive discrimination. We say, okay, we should ensure that minorities are represented. So we limit democracy in the interest of ensuring that minority groups are represented in the presidency, which is in practice rather powerless. But when it comes to the Prime Minister, we would say utterly shameful things, like Singapore is not ready for an Indian Prime Minister, when Mr. Tharman Shanmugam is very clearly the favourite of all Singaporeans and extremely qualified to be the next Prime Minister. But we would say things, the establishment would say things, like Singapore is simply not ready for an Indian Prime Minister. So not only are we stupefied, right, by our model of ethnic diversity, that also translates into some kind of comfort in the policies that we put in place to do with highest levels of leadership. And more recently, we've become a lot more sensitive, thankfully, to matters of privilege, matters of representation. So brown face has become an explosive subject of public discourse. And while it is uncomfortable for all parties involved, it's an opportunity, I think, for greater cultural learning. And here's where it's difficult, because race, religion, language, they're taboo subjects. The law is often applied in a very draconian way to protect, but in protecting, it also stifles discussion and discourse, and difficult discourse that generates understanding. So we're in that funny situation where it is dealt with in the most draconian way, which prevents us from using the public sphere in order to raise our cultural intelligence to deal with such matters as privilege and representation. Okay, so that's multiracialism. Talk a little bit about meritocracy. So I have a fairly positive view of meritocracy, at least in its more idealized version. And when put into the context of Singapore's earlier decades of development, right? A time when Singapore at least saw itself as vulnerable and was sensitive to its scarcity of talent as well. So in such conditions, it probably made sense to harness the best of capitalism and the best of socialism. And by that I meant putting in place a system that would incentivize people to be competitive, to work hard, to expect a reward if they worked hard and if they had qualities that were valued by the political community, and if they had the qualifications that indicated, pointed to those values. So meritocracy as a system of reward and incentive to generate more competitiveness, and in that sense to signal where the needs were in society so that the smartest, most talented people would find their way to these places, allocated efficiency. But also not to ignore the more, I guess, socialistic aspects of it. That is to say, starting points need to be reasonably equal in terms of the opportunities that are there for people to rise in the system. Social mobility is important, right? There are people at the bottom, no matter what circumstances they find themselves in, if they worked hard, had the right qualities and the right signals, could rise up to be rewarded with positions and the responsibility in those positions to do good for society. And those already in those positions who did not continue to deliver results or to work hard would have to make way for others. So there's something quite healthy about it, not least because being a part of a society like that can be enough reason for people to believe in it, right? It's that Singapore dream that if you work hard, if you did badly, then at least you did badly in a system that you could believe in, right? So it adds to the sense of fairness, adds to the potential for cohesion and a certain kind of social resilience. And I think to some degree, that was what was happening in Singapore in the earlier decades, the survivalist developmental period, and may account for much of Singapore's success, the best use of its talent. But since the 90s, I think a lot has changed. Most importantly, perhaps, is the way in which society itself has become so profoundly unequal, not just in terms of recognition, but in material terms as well. The divisions translate to the constriction of opportunity for those who find themselves at the bottom of a much more elongated pyramid. So social mobility becomes this almost unrealistic movement in a society where the gap has become so severe. Now, amongst many things that one should be worried about, I worry in particular about how elitism that inhabits the upper reaches of this triangle is also one reason for degeneracy, degeneration, rot, and so on and so forth, right? When energies are directed not so much at doing good for society, but to stay in those positions of power, to exclude competitors and so on. So I worry about that. I also worry about how those who've been left out, right, who've been excluded from these opportunities, will become disenchanted, disillusioned, angry, and those are the conditions in which the worst types of populism are possible. Finally, leadership. I won't say very much about it, except that pragmatism very often kind of limits us to the more transactional forms of leadership. We become kind of stuck in the obsession with material, survival, success, economic matters, the expectation that we would be provided for by a benign parental state. We become obsessed with security. Apathy becomes a value because you leave the good work to the government and don't mess things up, and it creates the conditions for infantilism. So while it may all seem placid and harmonious and peaceful, what it also does is it deprives people of the opportunity to learn how to be civic participants and to learn how to be democratic actors. And there will be times in the near future when those skills will be necessary. Infantilism means that many Singaporeans will not be equipped with such skills. So we lose the capacity to be more transformational, to deal with complexity and so on and so forth. Right? So I won't belabor this point. Right? So just to summarize, these are the different meanings of pragmatism. I think they're great when they for a certain context and when they are pursued in purer forms, but they very easily, like many ideal things, degenerate, and when they degenerate, we end up with all these sort of qualities that threaten Singapore's continued success. I just play out what can happen as a result of that. So what does politics and government look like as pragmatism degenerates? Okay, first of all, people in positions of power, they continue to be focused on doing rather than on reflecting and thinking critically. The attitude is if things are still working, no matter how badly they are working, just keep doing them, right? Don't try anything new. Anyone who has a different idea is viewed as obstruction. So they want to have consensus, but consensus is achieved by force, not something that is cultivated over time, built with social and civic abilities. So what do they do with people who persistently object? They are categorized as oppositional. Those who are who will simply not be reformed will be defined as radical. They'll be criminalized, will be exiled. Right. So that's one class of opposition. Others are oppositional and they're troublesome and they're annoying, but they're useful because holding them up can give a signal to the rest of the world that here is a tolerant Renaissance place which is able to accommodate different points of view. So it's a kind of demonstration of magnanimity. You have a usefulness there. So what happens to those who are pliable? They are co-opted into the system, and perhaps they might go into the system thinking, well, let me go into the system and change things from inside. But we know that in reality that rarely happens. Once inside, they are flattered by the system. There's hyper-competitiveness. They compete. They become one with the system. The focus is on career success. They defend the status quo at best. Whatever ideals they might have had outside the system translates into incrementalism. It's groupthink. And with groupthink, we are not able to slaughter the holy ideas of the past. Neither are we able to appreciate not just the elephant in the room, in the present, but the black elephant that everybody sees and knows is dangerous, but doesn't want to do anything about. And worse still, we're not prepared to deal with the unknowns of the future, the black swans. So maybe I'll end there.
Very much, Kenneth, for that fascinating insight into some of the more theoretical considerations behind Singapore's purported decline, which is something we can also discuss here. So there are plenty of topics, and I'm sure there are plenty of questions.
So you started to talk about foreign policy and sort of navigating U.S.-China dispute and so on.
Yeah.
So do you see this pragmatism also leading to potentially to rot in Singaporean foreign policy, or is that continuing to be successful?
That's a good question. So the pragmatism in the form of a kind of hyper-realist position, I think is alive, very much alive. Right? So alive is it that it's doctrinal, which is ironic because then it's the opposite of pragmatism, right? But it's become doctrinal. So on many embassy sites, for example, you'll find these things listed, right? That Singapore very explicitly says that it needs to make friends with everyone. It needs to be the word neutral is not used, but the sense is that Singapore cannot take sides. Singapore has to be non-ideological in terms of the transactions that it has with all parties. Singapore talks about ASEAN and so on and so forth. So that sense of realism, I think, is very healthy. That pragmatic sense of realism is very healthy in the way that Singapore navigates its course as that relationship between China and US evolves. And it has many lenses, some that are borrowed. So the Thucydides trap, for example, is often held up as a way of understanding the dynamics between the two. Singapore, other lenses have to do with how we understand the Chinese misunderstanding of Chineseness in Singapore, the expectation that we are somehow or other held together by blood ties, and that Singapore is yet another manifestation of China, and they cannot understand why it is that we talk about multiculturalism, why it is that we talk about our Southeast Asian nature, why it is that we don't stand up for China in the way that China would expect a relative to stand up for it. So we understand that they have that mindset, and so having that understanding, we try to kind of either work around that or cultivate that or try to keep it backstage. So I think I think it's the pragmatism that will probably allow Singapore to survive what's going on geopolitically. Everybody talks about it obsessively, almost to the exclusion of other global developments that will also be important for Singapore, but we don't talk about those things quite as much. Increasingly, there's been a discussion about how the democratization of Singapore, that is to say, citizens who are becoming much more articulate about public matters, might start to challenge the rational foreign policies that we're pursuing. So there's now this attention to the public voice in foreign policy. And so the thinking in the Foreign Affairs Ministry is that we should try and invest in educating the public more about geopolitics, about international affairs, so that because you can't stop these voices from coming in through the democratic process, so that when these voices do come in to the foreign policy process, they would be better informed of Singapore's particular circumstances. So I think that's kind of broadly where things are. It doesn't fully answer your question, but it's still kind of pragmatic in that sense.
Kobe, thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one, at the beginning, you
Yeah.
tried to put two sides, pros and cons for questions that
Oh,
you made
yeah.
in Singapore's, yeah. And for the negative ones, do you
Yeah.
think, well, it seems like lots of problems for a lot of places facing nowadays. Yeah, this one in particular. So how serious are the problem or the situations now in Singapore? And do you think it leads to, the end of the Singaporean finance?
How serious are these problems?
Right.
Yeah, you're right. You're right to say that you're right to say that some of these problems may be quite nascent. Some of these problems may be imminent in the sense that they're kind of embedded in the system, but they may not emerge or erupt in ways that could threaten the basic order of things, right? I think you're probably quite right to say this. So the way I look at that, the way I look at this is to think of it as like a ticking time bomb. That there are tendencies and trends imminent in the system that if they were all allowed to kind of reach their natural, logical conclusion, would actually spell quite a lot of disaster for Singapore. I mean, mental health is a ticking, it's a major problem. I'm glad that today we're talking about it in Singapore. We're not well known as a place that's very open with our data, for example. And but with mental health, I think the next 2 years or so, a lot of research, they say, is going to be put into the public gaze, because it's one of these problems that I think they recognize cannot be solved just from a top-down approach. So on some things, if nothing is done, they would, and if all of them sort of were allowed to flourish, then we would be in trouble. But the reality is not all of them flourish at the same time or to the same extent, and I think the government still has enough adaptability and sense-making ability to arrest some of these problems before they fester. So the question is, how open are they going to be to some of the more sensitive problems, some of the problems that they've always denied in the past? How open are they going to be to addressing them, and addressing them in an authentic way rather than in a just kind of tweaky sort of way? For instance, with inequality, for instance, a lot of people have pointed to this problem not just as a statistical issue, but there's been very popular ethnographic works, that sort of brings the reality of poverty and inequality squarely into the minds of the public. So it's really become a powerful discourse today. Ordinary people have the language for talking about poverty, for talking about inequality. So it's something that cannot be avoided. And yet for the longest time, and I say even today, the one sort of realist position that the government takes about human nature is that we cannot give free lunches, right? Because every time you help people, the assumption is that human nature will be greedy and will will consume more than they need, and when you systematize that, then the whole system fumbles, right? And they point to actual welfare systems around the world that have not done well, rather than pointing to the ones that have, right? And then, kind of demonstrate why we should never take that route. So I think that's where it's still very stubborn, and the language of dignity, the language of, some wider notions of capacity, and so on and so forth, just kind of doesn't come in.
Thank you so much. And I have a second question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, about the last one, that you pointed out the elitism in
Yeah.
Singapore. I'm just wondering how does the democracy work
Yeah.
in Singapore to avoid this from, because a lot of people say that, well, if you don't like the government, well, at the moment they do have a lot of, people satisfied with,
Yeah.
lots of policies in Singapore.
Yeah.
But then, in case if they do have this satisfaction, they just say that I can vote them out, just, use
Yeah.
their kind of, rights. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The mentality has just not been shaped that way. Democracy is often seen as it's compulsory, so everyone does it. It's periodic, so everyone has had an experience of some kind to do with that ritual. But the thinking hasn't been generally that you vote them out when they don't do well, right? It's not generally been like that. In fact, one of the operating assumptions of the opposition parties in the not too distant past was that opposition parties shouldn't give people the impression that they could win. Because then the people would vote even less for them, right? Because the assumption there is that everybody wants the PAP to be in power, but they want a few more voices, oppositional voices in parliament to serve as a check on an essentially effective government, right? So it's more like a concern about their arrogance, more a concern about their elite distance from the experience of ordinary people. It's more those kinds of concerns. So we're often described as, Lee Kuan Yew said this himself, that we're a nation of champion grumblers, right? So in other places, you see how public dissatisfactions get articulated, aggregated, and they become, the basis of resistance. They become the basis of, tactical voting. They become the basis even of protest. In Singapore, it just never quite goes beyond grumbling. So in moments when you might say Singapore could take some inspiration from others, not least the current situation that we're in, but also say Malaysia, right? When Malaysia had that moment, people were wondering if Singapore might follow after that. And it's hard to imagine that Singapore would, because, for all the faults of this government, they haven't done anything egregiously bad, right? So that's the thing. There's nothing that you could point to that you could really say is corrupt, or in that kind of spectacular way, right? You could make arguments about corruption, but they would be very nuanced and philosophical. So it's hard to point to something that you could galvanize people around and to resist. Then you have the problem of, if people anyway wanted to resist and vote for an opposition, they may not actually have the opportunity to do so, partly because they might find themselves in, so this is the Westminster first past the post system, right? So they might find themselves in constituencies where there's a walkover, so that they couldn't even vote for the opposition if they wanted to. Or if the opposition ran in that constituency, the opposition party has its limits in terms of how many good people it can have. So some constituencies are obviously not going to get the cream of the opposition politician. So I might want to vote for the Workers' Party, but the Workers' Party candidate in my constituency, I just wouldn't want that guy to be in charge of the municipal aspects of my living, right? So I don't have someone to vote for. That's one. The third thing is, you also need a kind of mobilization of consciousness, right? You need enough public intellectuals to exert intellectual, ideological leadership, so that people will they will acquire the language for making critical sense of what's wrong in Singapore. it's difficult to do that because, when you look at Singapore, it's this shiny city on a hill. If you didn't have critical lenses and critical vocabulary, you couldn't possibly fault it for many things. You feel that something's wrong in it, but you don't have a way of framing that. So there needs to be stronger public intellectualism. The social media has done a good job so far of galvanizing people's consciousness and providing them with an everyday language which they could use to make sense of their condition and to inspire others to do something about it. But I think not quite enough. So there are lots of things that I think, kind of keep Singapore in this weird way of unhappy people who are always complaining about the government, but they do not a damn thing.
Kenneth, if I could just interject at this point. If Singapore is in decline, it's got a lot of company in the world today.
Yes, that's also its
The
problem.
US, the UK, just to name a few countries in abrupt political decline. So when I think about the broader comparative context in which you're talking about Singapore, I think one thing it's fair to say is to put it polemically, the ravages of neoliberalism, the hollowing out of societies, the growing inequality, the poverty amidst plenty, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the things you were talking about we see in places like the US and the UK and elsewhere.
Yeah.
The distinctiveness, and that was what you were just talking about, is the political system, which is, even though it's a parliamentary democracy, is much less liberal in the way we normally understand the term. The PAP has been the dominant party, and most people would call the system an electoral authoritarian one.
Yes.
So my question is that really the key difference? Are we really talking about, when we're talking about this problem of pragmatism, are we talking about the erosion of an authoritarian ideology, which, while successful in the early stages of economic development and undoubted success in Singapore's, progress in a number of ways, has, reached its sell-by date?
Yeah.
And that, going back to your previous discussion, that in the case of Singapore, a greater political openness would be one solution. Whereas, of course, in the case of the UK and the US, it seems like a problem of democracy and the problems of that. But am I right to understand that this is kind of an authoritarian problem?
So I would actually frame it differently, and maybe even the opposite of what you just said. I would say that pragmatism in the way that it's come to embrace, or maybe even in the way that it has become neoliberalism, a manifestation of neoliberalism, has actually prompted very subtle and sophisticated modes of authoritarianism that are even harder to first of all to put your finger on. Because you look at Singapore today and you look at Singapore 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and most people would say, of course, it was a tougher time, it was a more draconian time with Lee Kuan Yew, but today it's this model of openness, cultural openness, it's this global city that's open to everyone, and so on and so forth, and that's the spectacle of Singapore's political, cultural, economic liberalization. But the reality, I think, is that what's happened is that the authoritarianism has come to filter into all the cracks. It's insinuated itself into the system. It's in the air. It's no longer about arresting people all the time. It's no longer about suing people all the time. All it takes now is just those few occasions when someone is threatened with a lawsuit, and then all these things in the air start to be activated, and you hear voices in your head, and and it's that heavy breathing, it's that sense of, did I not make tenure because of what I signed? But you don't know, right? You won't know, and I think that's actually what it's like now. It's the insidiousness of it. It's filtered into every crack and pore of the system, and nobody can point to a face, nobody can point to an apparatus, nobody can point to a sector in the society that is responsible for it. It's going to get even worse because, we're moving into this smart city phase, right, where each of us is in fact a sensor, right, and a producer of data that will become the very instruments of our control. Nobody has to hire an army of people to sit in a warehouse and surveil our every move. Nobody ever has to do that. The technology is such that if you needed a profile, all you have to do is press a button, there you go, right? So I think it's this sort of, on the one side is progress, openness, globality, technological sophistication, living with great convenience and intelligence as a result of data, sense-making, connectivity. On the other side of this, the dystopian side, is that more and more we are controllable, we are surveillable, and for those people who are at risk, it's panopticon all over again, right? You would then police yourself, and you would make those kinds of decisions about what to say, what to do, if you stay, or whether you should leave. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So the greatest irony is therefore that the thing that the PAP has been most pragmatic about is authoritarianism.
Yeah.
That's,
I think so.
the authoritarianism has become far more subtle, far more adaptable, far more enduring and resilient, and less in your face and less overtly repressive. And that's the great irony, right? Because you would expect authoritarianism to be the decaying element of the system, whereas the pragmatism one is the one that is constantly renewing itself. As you point out, those elements of pragmatism that enabled Singapore's early success in the first 40, 50 years, those bits are the bits that are decaying, whereas authoritarianism is the bit that is being renewed.
There's a resilience to it. There's a real resilience.
And adaptability.
Yeah, adaptability. So where will change come? I think change will come, as it's adapting in these ways. Change will come with these kinds of things. People's mental states. Change will come when people suddenly find themselves in a truly unbearable condition, right? Then whatever the rhetoric might be, whatever the imagery of Singapore might be, however resilient the government might be in taming our desires, if we find life to be unbearable, then that's, I think, an opportunity for mobilization, an opportunity for change. And that's when, I suppose, suddenly a change happens, right? But is that going to happen anytime soon? I doubt that very much. So all I'm willing to do is just to kind of plot the starting points of trajectories for that change.
Can you say something about what might Hong Kong and the Hong Kong government
You mean offer a solution?
In many ways, Hong Kong is also an experiment, an extreme example of neoliberal globalization. Obviously, with a far less authoritarian and competent state. But in many ways, the sort of dysfunctions that you point out, or the emerging nascent dysfunctions around inequality, elitism, weakness of hollowing out the public space. You see, so it's gotten to more or less some semblance of the same destination, but via a rather different.
Very, so vastly different, right? So, okay, so let me just clutch things in here. I think, so both societies are often described as pragmatic, right? But the Hong Kong society and the youthful parts of that society, especially in the last 10, 15 years or whatever, has also been characterized as idealistic, also having these moments of idealism. So one sort of reading there is that pragmatism can drain your spirit in a certain kind of way, and young people crave meaning, right? Purpose, value. But the language that's available to them for value and purpose and meaning draws from liberal, very classical liberal democracy, which the mythology tells them came from the British colonial experience. Of course, the reality is not, right? They were colonial masters. So, I mean, maybe only in the loosest sense was there the practice of real liberal democratic values in this place. But that language is available. And so I think the young generation, in an appeal for ideals and motivation, things to inspire them, use that language. So they talk of freedom, liberty. So I wonder, what does that liberty mean, right? So I don't think it is actually the liberty that is theorized and philosophized in liberal democracy as a philosophy, right? So I don't think it's that. I don't think it's fighting for abstract values. I think it may have more to do with the sensation of freedom, right, that Hong Kong people have. That you can do lots of things here and get away with it. You can prosper by finding cracks and possibilities and opportunities. You're not relying on authority and systems and all that. You make your own opportunities. So I think it's a little bit more like that, right? That's what freedom, I think, really means. And that's the kind of freedom that they're fighting for, the young people. The irony, though, maybe not the irony, but the tragedy, is that sort of freedom is the same thing that obfuscates what is perhaps at the heart of the problem, which is that freedom is the freedom for rich people to keep their wealth and not be required or encouraged, persuaded to share it, which explains the vast inequality in this place. So then that produces material conditions for why the students are agitating in this way. It could well be that living in small home environments mean that the troubles that they face include things like family frictions, kind of dealing with the problems of living like that, right, which is repressed. And one might quite simply say that part of the motivation for the protests and so on and so forth is just a kind of return of the repressed, right? Those repressed energies of being put into small places and having to find outlets takes the form of cathartic behavior. In the worst forms, takes the form of violent behavior, the smashing of things, the anger that's inside. And you might say the anger that's misdirected, because it's anger that perhaps should more properly be directed at the actual causes of inequality, which is an elite system of property rights that deprives many young Hong Kong people of fuller experience of material life. Is that fair?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, sure enough, we ended up with Hong Kong.
At least it wasn't Trump.
Well, we have a bit of him there.
That's true.
I want to again thank you very much for a fascinating lecture and also for this great discussion.
Thank you.